Hi, my name is Martin Koehring. I'm the head of Economist Impact's World Ocean Initiative, which imagines an ocean in robust health and with a vital economy. The World Ocean Summit is an integral part of the work we do on accelerating a sustainable ocean economy. You can find out more about the initiative's work, including coverage of key themes discussed during the summit on our website, ocean.economist.com. Welcome to this plenary panel on harnessing the power of seaweed. Seaweed is a climate-friendly source of food and feed and is also highly efficient at storing carbon. Seaweed, a marine algae, requires no fresh water or fertilizers to thrive, is fast-growing and nutrient-intense, and doesn't interfere with land-based systems. It has a number of end uses such as carbon dioxide removal via biosequestration. Globally, macroalgae deliver up to 3.5 billion US dollars in nutrient bio mitigation services. So Asia is a global leader in seaweed production. China, Indonesia, and the Philippines are the main producers. This session will explore how Asia is driving growth, how it can harness the power of seaweed to address food security concerns, and how to restore abundance to the ocean and mitigate climate change. I'm joined today by three excellent and very experienced panelists. So first of all, we have Ronald Simbajon. He's director of the Seaweed Industry Association of the Philippines. And then we have Joe Kelly, chief executive of the Australian Seaweed Institute. And last but not least, Fred Puckle Hobbs. He's chief operating officer of Seagreen. You will find out the full biographies of our panelists on the screen under this media player. There are also a few additional resources there, including links to relevant articles on seaweed and sustainable seafood opportunities from the World Ocean Initiative. I would like to structure today's discussion in four main parts. So first of all, introducing the seaweed industry in the Asia Pacific region, and then talking about some of the challenges for the seaweed industry in the region, and then talking about some of the Asia Pacific partnership opportunities, and finally, how do we harness kind of new innovations, new technologies, new data in this space? So without further ado, let's start with just an introduction to the seaweed industry in the Asia Pacific region. Our speakers have a lot to say about that, of course. I'd like to start with Ronald. I mean, Ronald, you lead the Seaweed Industry Association of the Philippines, and the Philippines is a top producer and exporter of seaweed, both in its raw forms and in its processed forms. How does the Philippines plan to reinforce the seaweed industry's sustainability and resilience?
Yeah, Martin, the seaweed industry, the seaweed farming was first introduced in the Philippines in the early 1970s. It was initially an alternative source of a form of livelihood for small-scale fishermen, but interestingly, it emerged as an important source of livelihood. At present, it ranks as the most important fishery commodity in the Philippines and ranks as it produces about 70%, contributes 70% of the total aquaculture production of the country. It is also one of the top three export commodity of the fishery sector in the Philippines. And seaweed is used as an important source of carrageenan. It's a seaweed derivative for food applications, for other biotechnology and others. And in the Philippines, we're talking about 200,000 small-scale fishermen that is spread in remote places in the Philippines. And the country has 16 processing plants that requires about 140,000 metric tons annually. But the production of the Philippines in terms of seaweed production volume is just hovers around 100,000 metric tons. So we have a shortage of around 40,000 tons annually. So we need to cope up with this shortage. And then with the increasing demand of hydrocolloids in the world market, we really need to encourage the farmers to produce more. Martin.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot, Ronald. And you highlighted, that seaweed is such an important source of, the livelihood in the Philippines. 70% of aquaculture production is among the top three fisheries exports. I mean, you just, highlighted just in terms of looking at the Philippines, how important seaweed is. Joe, I'd also ask you about, particularly about Australia, of course. It's very early days for seaweed in Australia. I mean, how does Australia plan to harness the power of seaweed and build a regenerative new industry to benefit people and the planet?
Yes, it is very early days in Australia for seaweed, Martin, but we've recognised that it's an important emerging industry and that there's huge potential for seaweed to have a role or play a role in economic, social and environmental impact here. So we really see, this enormous potential for a new seaweed aquaculture industry to actually help diversify livelihoods of the existing aquaculture industry, but also, some of the work that I'm doing is looking at how seaweed biofilters can help improve water quality and protect the Great Barrier Reef. So we're really looking at sort of nature-based solutions, how these can be used, how regenerative aquaculture can be used sort of as targeted interventions and provide ecosystem services, as well as, generating revenue from the products too. And I guess we've had a really exciting discovery in Australia in the last couple of years, and that's the Asparagopsis seaweed that reduces methane emissions in cattle. And we're really seeing that sort of drive a lot of investment and interest in establishing a sustainable industry here in Australia. So it's early days, but there's a lot of interest and excitement, and we are really looking at how it can provide that triple top line input to the Australian economy, as well as providing coastal jobs and great environmental benefits too.
Amazing. Thanks a lot, Joe. Highlighting this enormous potential, to diversify the aquaculture industry, but also, as you highlighted, in terms of the seaweed biofilters that you have come up with to kind of improve water quality using kind of nature-based solutions and regenerative agriculture techniques. As well. There's super exciting as well. Fred, I would like to ask you as well in terms of, of course, there is this significant global momentum for seaweed now, as a resource for tackling food security and climate change. So for Sea Green, you focus on integrated coastal management to optimize blue economy value chains for the benefit of local communities. Where do you see the biggest potential?
Thanks, Martin. It's a very interesting question in terms of the greatest potential. And for me, I'd sort of echo what Joe is saying. There's an element here that this is a holistic solution for us. This is something that really crosses boundaries, crosses sectors, and something that we can't look at as a solution in isolation. So in recent years, we've heard a lot about the potential for carbon sequestration and carbon replacement or carbon drawdown. But for us, we see this as a holistic solution that tracks across carbon, biodiversity, nutrient reallocation, nutrient balance, and indeed, as you said, social development and social equity, as it were, across coastal communities. And this is something that's extremely important in this day and age, especially since the existing seaweed industry in so many parts of Asia is quite fractured. And that's through no fault of the local communities themselves. It's simply an imbalanced chain that's really, really focused on the needs of the far end, as it were. So the end consumer requires, as Ronald quite rightly said, a considerable quantity of carrageenan and other seaweed extract values. But the problem is that very little of the value that's derived from these products actually returns to the front end of the chain, to the farmers who produce the stuff at the ground level. And the problem there is that if there's not really any value returning to those farmers, they remain effectively indebted in some cases to middlemen, indebted to traders, and unable to upgrade their business practices in a way that helps them to further their own livelihoods and to upgrade their livelihoods, which is a really, really interesting sort of paradigm to be in, because it's an industry of such huge potential globally. And as you rightly said, over 98%, I think, is the actual figure of the industry is in Asia. We're looking at an extremely small utilization of coastline, even in Asia itself. But then if we take that to the wider scale, Europe, Asia, America, Africa all together have huge coastal potential for development. But the critical piece for me is that this is an element of the of coastal ecosystems and integrated coastal management that could really be upgraded in a way that supports multiple types of aquaculture. And we've already heard of this idea of regenerative farming, regenerative ocean aquaculture, but actually this concept of IMTA, or integrated multi-trophic aquaculture, so bringing in different types of seafood farming together with seaweed, in order to be able to increase abundance and multiply biodiversity on the ground in these communities, gives farmers an opportunity to create multiple revenue streams, and adding in things like ecosystem services as well just multiplies that benefit. So for me, really, in terms of seaweed's potential, given the vast untapped ocean areas that we have, It's this possibility of creating integrated coastal zone management for local communities globally, and underpinning a really vibrant source of food security, as you say, for the planet, for people, and ultimately leveraging the other potential types of benefit that come from seaweed across climate change, and of course, as I mentioned, the social benefit for these communities. So yeah, a lot to be cracking on with, as it were.
Definitely, thanks, Fred, for highlighting this holistic perspective. I mean, looking at seaweed as in an integrated way, as as part of integrated coastal management, looking at it, the economic, social, as well as the environmental dimensions of it. But you mentioned some of those kind of potential challenges that the industry already faces in terms of low utilization, and actually making sure that the front end, the farmers actually get the benefits as well. I mean, I would just like to follow up on that. I mean, as the seaweed industry continues to grow, I mean, what kind of barriers are there to fulfilling the industry's potential and ensuring safe and sustainable production? I mean, and how can these be overcome, Fred?
Well, it's a big question, that one, Martin. I have to say, there are lots of different areas in which change needs to come, and it's interesting that actually the change itself is a vector for social improvement in and of itself, as it were. So, if we think about the idea that actually the industry itself can drive change at a social level, but it can also drive change from an economic level, from an economic standpoint, and from an academic standpoint as well, I think it's something it's almost self-fulfilling in nature. And bearing that in mind, the big challenges for me really relate to data paucity. So the lack of data at the primary level in the value chain is absolutely critical within the seaweed industry. So at Seagreen, we spent a couple of years delivering or completing a commissioned research report on the state of the Indonesian seaweed industry. And that ended with a series of recommendations of areas in which change could be brought. But really, the key point that actually formed the basis of why Seagreen was created and founded was this idea that there lacks any kind of real traceability data in the seaweed industry, but that traceability data could also underpin a whole host of other types of services that themselves will create data for the seaweed industry. So bringing together a holistic package of services for seaweed farmers to be able to upgrade their livelihoods, bring in things like capital investment and new research, again, something that's really lacking at the moment in the seaweed industry. And perhaps a big paradigm for this is the division between the global north and global south. At this time, most research in seaweed is either done in the global north or in other temperate zones. And that means that there's a great deal coming out of the potential of seaweed in institutions like Wageningen University in the Netherlands, various Scandinavian institutions, Europe, the UK, the US, and Australia. But at the moment, actually very little research, or only the beginnings of research, is being undertaken in Asia. And it's really critical that we actually start to connect the dots here, because in a lot of cases, it's the lack of cooperation there that's really driving, or continuing, I suppose, the lack of momentum that's needed to get seaweed moving in terms of the potential that the industry has. So if you couple together the data paucity and that lack of cooperation, again, potentially resolving those two challenges could be a great building block to starting for us to tap into the potential of the seaweed industry.
Mm-hmm. And thanks for highlighting the kind of lack of cooperation. We get to the need for collaboration and partnerships later, but highlighting already, this kind of traceability data challenge is really crucial, and the need for more collaboration. I would like to ask Joe as well about, the challenges. I mean, at the Australian Seaweed Institute, you are one of the pioneers of Australia's emerging seaweed industry. You have also created a blueprint for the economic, social, and environmental dimensions of the Australian seaweed industry. What are the key challenges for the industry that you are seeing, and how can they be overcome?
Well, because it's such an early stage here, we've got sort of some fundamental gaps in the capability that we need to build the industry. So you highlighted that we have an Australian seaweed industry blueprint, and that was published by the federal government here in Australia, and that really charts the target to hit sort of $100 million industry in the next 5 years, and growing that to a $1.5 billion industry over the coming decades, and employing, thousands of people and providing those environmental services. So we've got a good strategy, and we've actually just put together the Australian Sustainable Seaweed Alliance, and we've got the major players in Australia who are leading the seaweed industry have joined that. So we've come come together as an industry to start to look at our shared needs across the board. And really what that's highlighting is that there's a couple of key gaps. The first one is around sort of policy or regulation for seaweed aquaculture, and that's restricting access to ocean lease areas. So as our friends in the Philippines will tell us, you know, this is not sort of small lease areas that we're used to growing oysters on and that kind of thing. This is large lease areas, and we don't have any real examples of that here in Australia at the moment. So trying to, and we don't have bespoke seaweed aquaculture policy, except in one state, and it's actually different in each of the states of Australia as well. So that creates its own sort of challenges. So we're looking at how we can influence that policy and start to look at how we can streamline that to get some more pilots at least off the ground while we're working on the longer term plan to get larger ocean lease areas approved. So that's one. The second one is really around skills and knowledge. And this is a big gap for us because, you know, it isn't an established industry. There aren't a lot of sort of seaweed phycologists and people with seaweed aquaculture experience here because there aren't the jobs here at the moment. So, you know, we're really interested in looking at the rest of Asia in terms of what we can learn from them and looking at partnerships and how we can actually sort of leverage some of that skills and knowledge and bring that here as well. And then all those two things really then make it difficult to attract early stage investment into the seaweed industry here as well. So there are a number of ventures, some of which have just been raising some great capital. So we've just had Sea Forest in Tasmania. They've raised over 30 million to develop Asparagopsis taxiformis seaweed down in Tasmania. And then CH4 Global have raised something like 15 million as well to do their work in South Australia, and also they're working in New Zealand as well. So we're starting to see some big capital raises, and a lot of that does depend on closing some of those early gaps around access to ocean leases and the skills and knowledge, particularly species-specific life cycle skills and knowledge.
I mean, thanks a lot, Jo. I mean, you highlighted, you know, the need for policy regulation to be kind of conducive, you know, rather than restricting access, you know, and also the, you know, the need for skills and knowledge. I'd also like to ask Ronald about, you know, the challenges that you see. I mean, when we look at the seaweed industry and its potential in the Philippines, I mean, what do you see as the biggest challenges? For example, what kind of challenges do the farmers face in areas such as access to finance, equipment, technology, training, and so on?
Martin, when seaweed was first introduced 40 years ago, it's the same procedure that is being used by the seaweed farmers in terms of culture, in terms of farming, and the seedling that they used 40 years ago is the same that seedling that are being used at the present. So there is lack of research on genetics improvement of seaweeds, and it has shown already that there's a diminishing genetics on the seaweed. So it's not producing as good as before. So there is a need to do a research into genetic improvements of seaweeds. So at present, the seaweed industry is in collaboration with University of San Carlos and University of the Philippines Marine Science Institute to maintain a genetics seedling bank, maintaining different propagules of seaweeds. And from there, a good quality seedlings will be sourced and then transferred to nurseries, and that would be used for the seaweed farmers to be able to get better seedling materials for their farming. Martin.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Ronald. I mean, highlighting, you know, the need for, you know, genetic improvement and the need for research. And there was something that that all of you mentioned in one way or another, which is, you know, how to kind of overcome the challenges of kind of building partnerships. And I'd like to, you know, to ask Ronald, you know, you that question in terms of, you know, overcoming these challenges that we heard about. And the role of partnerships and collaborations. You know, at the Seaweed Industry Association of the Philippines, you work closely with government agencies, seaweed farmers, other stakeholders to create these kind of synergies that are needed to overcome the challenges you mentioned. I mean, could you expand on this and give us a few examples of your collaborations and what makes them successful?
Yeah, again, as I said, the seaweed industry is in partnership with different government agencies, with the Bureau of Fisheries and Aquatic Resources, Department of Agriculture, to establish a state-of-the-art seaweed seedling banks. That's one. And then, because we recognize the challenges that's facing the industry today, the Seaweed Industry Association of the Philippines, in partnership with the Department of Agriculture, developed this short, medium, and long-term seaweed development program. And this is this intends to improve the production volume of the farmers, at the same time to give equity of the farmers in the value chain. Martin.
Thanks a lot, Ronald. And I mean, you highlighted, the need to work with, government agencies, Department of Agriculture, you mentioned, and to look at the kind of short, medium, and long term. I'd also like to ask Fred, in terms of the collaborations and partnerships that you see. I mean, Seagreen works closely with Mary Oceans, for example, to maximize impact for coastal communities and scale up solutions. You also promote the North-South cooperation you mentioned earlier, the challenges in the Global South. For example, through the UN Global Compact, partnerships with Blue Carbon Lab, AIC Singapore, and the Safe Seaweed Coalition. Tell us a bit more about kind of your partnerships and collaborations, how these can help to accelerate a sustainable seaweed industry.
Thanks, Martin. That's actually a really, really nice one to talk about, because I think my experience in the seaweed industry, which obviously is shorter than Ronald's for sure, and Joe's, I would almost guess certainly, it's been fantastic to work in this industry for the period of time that I have, because I've found that, especially during COVID, people are really, really willing to work together within this industry. It's a very, very positive, vibrant, almost fun place to work. You really feel like on a day-to-day basis, you're making a big difference. And as you say, one of the nice things that we have within Seagreen is our close partnership with Mary Oceans. So another company that's very, very closely tied to Seagreen in terms of development. And what Mary Oceans does is create governance structures on the ground with coastal communities in Indonesia. And the intention is that Mary Oceans will grow from initially what it's doing at the moment, a pilot site for growing in Bone, South Sulawesi, with just a small number of farmers insured by Seagreen and Mary Oceans, so protection products there. But actually growing that group through collaboration and cooperation into multiple thousands of farmers across Indonesia, collaborating and cooperating, sharing resource and access to technology like those mentioned by Ronald. So things like new seedling technology, new practices for drying and harvesting, and ensuring that we're getting the most out of those structures on the ground for farming seaweed at the primary level. But then when we take that a step further, collaboration is also really heavily baked into the value chain itself, and bringing together these partnerships, like you mentioned, across the research institutions. So as you rightly mentioned, the Aquaculture Innovation Centre here in Singapore, very interested in the properties of seaweed to support their own ambitions around Singapore itself, but to take that knowledge, as Joe mentioned, there's a lack of it across the whole region. And this is something that we're seeing very good momentum on now across a range of coalitions. Again, you mentioned the Safe Seaweed Coalition. This is a new initiative from Lloyd's Register and the UN Global Compact, obviously closely involved. And one of the outputs we saw there that was really fantastic in terms of its vision was a statement that was released on the power of seaweed as a nature-based solution to climate change. And this is something which Seagreen was closely involved in. We really tried hard to highlight the need for international cooperation, particularly between the global north and global south, as it's described, between Asia and Europe, for example. But also beyond that, to see the importance of working directly with those coastal communities. So Ronald's already mentioned that there's lots of seaweed farmers who've been doing this for a very long time, and that's true in Indonesia as well. So it's making sure that we actually take collaboration from being something that happens just in theory at a company level or at a public-private partnership level in this kind of environment, having conversations over Zoom calls, to actually true collaboration that works at the ground level to bring in potential research and new practices to improve the industry. And as I say, this is something that's been happening in a fantastic way in the last couple of years, especially with the profile that seaweed's generated. The final piece, obviously, is you mentioned the Blue Carbon Lab in Australia. So this is an institution with which Seagreen is in partnership, very close partnership. We fund a PhD into the potential of blue carbon, particularly in the seaweed industry. And as people have sort of rightly pointed out, that the industry at the moment is quite siloed. And I know Ronald mentioned the power of carrageenan as a very, very in-demand commodity globally at the moment. But we're looking at all these different alternative uses for seaweed, including as kind of linchpin of blue carbon development across monitoring systems and actually carbon reduction or carbon dioxide reduction systems, as it were. But then things like biodiversity also come out of the back of that sort of research. It's important to understand that simply by sequestering carbon, you're not solving the whole issue. And it's only by collaborating that we see the bigger picture and the holistic nature of the solution. So for me, collaboration is absolutely at the root of everything we do. And at Seagreen, the platform that we're designing, the blockchain that we're using is all about interoperability of ecosystems, bringing in different actors in the value chain together to work on these problems, but also bringing in non-value chain actors. So the research institutions, the government agencies, the green innovators, the financiers, the insurers, and the education partners to make sure that we're all trying to solve these challenges together as a team.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot, Fred, for highlighting those collaborations. I mean, you mentioned some practical examples, which is really nice. I mean, I mentioned the PhD on blue carbon, bringing the research community in it and other non-value chain actors, but also looking into these alternative uses. And we get to that when we talk about new innovations as well. But the need to work closely with local communities and bringing these kind of collaborations to very practical level is crucial, as you mentioned. Joe, I'd also like to ask you about kind of cross-sector partnerships. I mean, they have been crucial for you too, of course, as you build the seaweed industry in Australia. I mean, the Australian Seaweed Institute has partnered with organizations such as CH4 Global, Future Feed, the University of Tasmania, to set up the Australian Sustainable Seaweed Alliance that you mentioned earlier. Tell us a bit more about your experience of collaboration in the sector and how to make the most of these partnerships.
Yes, well, I had a lot of experience with collaboration trying to get the industry sort of grouped together. So the Australian Sustainable Seaweed Alliance, or ASA for short. So that started with 4 partners that, started working together. You mentioned CH4 Global, UTAS, which is the University of Tasmania, Australian Seaweed Institute, and Future Feed. And so we started working together to sort of say, look, we've all got common challenges, and how can we actually do some work together to overcome some of those. So we've now got 10 companies that have joined the alliance, which is great. And we're starting to share, sort of work out how we can collaborate, because there is still a bit of, competition in terms of, trying to get to market first and all of those sorts of things. But sort of my view is that particularly with things like the methane reducing animal feed, the vast demand that exists for that means that there isn't competition anytime soon for production of that product to feed the 1.5 billion cows in the world. So, we're trying to look at how we can actually encourage collaboration or co-opetition. Co-opetition is a new word that we've been using rather than competition. And so that's kind of at a local level. I guess then also some of the key partnerships that we have at a local level on each individual project is really with our Indigenous sea country people in each area. That's been really important and really productive in terms of getting some of these seaweed projects up and running. Also, we're collaborating closely with some of the regulators as well as the local, state and federal government, product manufacturers, impact investors, and the supply chain, so the actual users. So we're seeing a really interesting sort of collaboration with the meat and livestock industry here in Australia, particularly over that animal feed that reduces methane emissions. So lots of important sort of local partnerships. And I also, I see the international partnerships forming up nicely as well, although in the very early stages. So I'm actually on the steering committee of the Safe Seaweed Coalition. They're doing some fantastic work in terms of championing some of the key initiatives that we need to see globally to move us all forward. And we are, as in Australia as well, we're really looking to form some of our own international partnerships as well. As I mentioned earlier, our skills and knowledge and workforce, there's a big gap there. So we're really looking at how we can benefit and bring in some of that capability here to Australia as well. So yeah, lots of lots of great stakeholder engagement. The exciting thing is that seaweed has the potential to tick so many boxes in terms of sustainable food, contribution to sustainable development goals, particularly life below water, regenerative aquaculture. So it's sort of, there's so many benefits here that we've got so much interest from a really broad range of stakeholders. So that's a really good starting point. Everyone's positive.
Brilliant. That's great to hear that everyone's positive. And you mentioned I like this term, co-petition. Working with local partnerships, but also kind of in a positive, competitive spirit to really bring the industry forward. You mentioned the corporations, regulators, impact investors, and supply chain, and also looking at the meat and livestock industry, because as you mentioned, there is that innovation with feed. And I just wanted to, as we talk about innovations and new technologies, I wanted to kind of follow up on that. You mentioned not only the innovation there with the feed, but also you have been working on, the seaweed biofilters, for example, for the Great Barrier Reef, that you mentioned. What are the kind of the new exciting innovations for seaweed that you see beyond the ones we already talked about? What's on the horizon? For example, in terms of using seaweeds to control carbon emissions, how can these innovations be harnessed?
Well, we have just had a big announcement here in Australia where there's about 70 million Australian dollars of investment from the federal government going into what we're calling marine bioproducts. So the Marine Bioproducts Cooperative Research Centre is looking at matching industry investment into innovation. There's a big focus on, we're behind on cultivation, so we need to, start actually growing seaweeds here. But the other side of it is, there's thousands of native species of seaweed that are native to Australia. And so there'll be a good look at some of the bioactives in some of those seaweeds and what potentially we might be able to develop out of those. We're seeing some work, particularly in like wound dressings has been an interesting one that's coming out of Australia. So wound dressings, also like fire retardant clothing material, as well as things like bioplastics is obviously, kind of more well developed in other countries around the world, but that's a really interesting one to watch. I'm doing some work with nanotechnology from seaweed and what we might be able to do with that to help increase forest growth and carbon drawdown. So there's really it feels like there's sort of no end to what we can do with seaweed. I guess the other side of it is really the innovation in the manufacturing and the processing capability. So the, integrated biorefineries that can actually look at how we can get more than one product out of a seaweed in future is, adds so much value to the crop itself. And then that will help, to leverage that value back to farmers as well. So, I'll let the other guys talk, but there seems to be endless amounts of seaweed innovation, particularly from the product side.
Amazing. That's really great to hear, Joe, in terms of, the innovations that you mentioned. Wound dressing, clothing, bioplastics, biorefineries. It's a very exciting space to be in. Fred, I'd also like to ask you, we've talked about the great opportunities for innovation in the seaweed industry. For example, the integrated multi-trophic aquaculture you mentioned, or IMTA, to kind of help kelp biomes, for example. Where do you see the most important innovations for the future, and how can we make the most of that?
That's a big question as well, Martin. The most important innovation for me, I think you've already just said it. I'd say that from our perspective, IMTA isn't a game changer so much. It's something that's been around for a long time. And let's be clear for the moment that IMTA may sound like an exciting term, but really it refers to polyculture. And the fact is, any sustainable farming system needs to avoid monoculture as much as possible. We cannot simply go into a situation where we plant 12 million hectares of seaweed on its own. That will not help local biomes at all. And rightly, we also need to start doing research into what IMTA looks like, or regenerative farming, or polyculture, or whatever we want to call it, looks like for Asian industry in terms of seaweed. So this is looking at red seaweeds and how they can be made to be part of IMTA systems. And taking this beyond just the kelp, which obviously is extremely exciting, but let's remember that in terms of industrial output, red seaweeds are the ones which are primarily used globally. And as Ronald said, carrageenan and gracilaria producing agar, those kind of industrial thickeners are in incredible demand globally. Now, if we remove back to the kelp side of things, that might be a more appealing product in terms of its organic value. And I think that's something that's been driven again by the global north. That's not a problem. That's fantastic in and of itself, but we need to see the same research for tropical seaweeds as well. And we need to start looking at those multiple product uses that Joe mentioned. So things like looking at bioplastics, biofertilizer, all need to be brought in as multiple fractionates, as you quite rightly mentioned, from those biorefineries. So the ability for local communities to use simple, small supply chain or short supply chain development, as it were, to create new product opportunities and new revenue streams for these coastal communities, for me, is absolutely critical. And being able to farm other types of seafood alongside seaweed, increase the abundance, increase the biodiversity, and ultimately create flourishing ecosystems is perhaps the most important thing at the end of the day. But as we mentioned earlier, I think another area which is really, really critical for seaweed is making sure that we have the right technology to underpin the value chain. So I mentioned that we're working on a blockchain platform. That's really Sea Green's reason to be. The intention is to be able to provide exactly the kind of commercial and traceability and monitoring infrastructure that farmers can use on their mobile phones, and to provide it in a way that is cost effective, easy to use, and supports the needs of all of the actors in the value chain. And again, in terms of exciting new innovation, that's not really a new thing. We're bringing in technologies that have been in existence for quite some time, but we're bringing them together in the right combination and the right way to support this industry. So it's all very well, and I really, really support these new potential product uses, research into new types of seaweed. The piece around Asparagopsis is fantastic and has the potential to revolutionize the livestock industry. But there's so much more than just these single isolated, siloed potential uses. We need to consider what they can all do together and in harmony with nature.
Yeah, that's a great point, Fred. And you mentioned the right combination of technologies, not necessarily coming up with all kinds of new fancy technology itself, but combining the ones that we know. And you mentioned IMTA has been around for a while, blockchain has been around for a while, but making sure that it actually creates these new revenue streams and flourishing ecosystem that you mentioned is crucial. Ronald, I'd also like to ask you about the kind of new innovation that you are seeing. I mean, we talked about the great potential for seaweed in the Philippines. I mean, the many opportunities already being harnessed. I mean, where do you see the biggest potential for further innovation and progress, for example, in terms of kind of emerging seaweed species, products, cultivation technologies in the Philippines?
And Martin, in the next 5 years, the seaweed industry with the Philippines is focused on two red seaweeds, this Eucuma and Capaphycus, for carrageenan extraction. We're trying to close the gap between demand and supply, because at present there is about 50% of the demand of the production that needs. The processing requirements of the processors. There is a 50% shortage, so we need to fill in the gap. So in the next 5 years, the seaweed industry and the Department of Agriculture is trying to close in that gap to at least produce 1 to 2%, in addition to the annual increase of red seaweeds. So other than Eucuma and Capaphycus or the carrageenan bearing seaweeds, we are also trying to develop this green seaweed olva for feeds. So at the moment, we are utilizing olva and we are harvesting it from the wild. And other than the olva, we also have gracilaria for agar productions. But the main focus of the Philippine seaweed industry is really the red seaweeds, Eucuma and Capaphycus.
Okay, brilliant. Yeah. Thanks a lot, Ronald, for highlighting that. Expanding into green seaweed, closing the demand between between supply and closing the gap between demand and supply, as you mentioned. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, but it's been incredibly, informative and incredibly insightful to hear from you and your different perspectives in terms of how the seaweed industry can scale up and the opportunities to, build a sustainable seaweed industry. I mean, we heard about the enormous potential, the economic, social, environmental potential, the holistic need to look at integrated coastal management. We heard about some of the challenges in terms of access to finance, equipment, technology, training, regulation, and permits, but also the skills challenge, and also navigating the regulation policy and actually creating a policy in many countries. The challenge between the research that is being mainly focused on the global north and closing that gap, but also the great opportunities when it comes to partnerships and looking at new collaborations, but baking them into the value chain, as we heard, and using the right combination of technologies, because there's so many exciting new innovations coming up, as we talked about biofertilizers, biorefineries, bioplastics, and so on, but using the right combination of technology and harnessing all the potential for data and technology in the region. So thanks a lot to all of the panelists for your great insights. The next session at the World Ocean Summit Asia Pacific will be the aquaculture track, focusing on scaling sustainably to address food security concerns. Thank you very much, and we hope to welcome you again soon.